Thank you and good morning. This is the session that is explicitly about finance, but finance has been mentioned, I think, a number of times before. But that's why I just wanted to say a couple of words how we at CDK sees what do we mean by climate finance, and that is, for us, it's really primarily about resourcing climate-compatible development. It's not the magic word of climate funds. It's a lot broader than that. Jose Garibaldi yesterday actually made a very interesting reference to that and afterwards in the discussion they talked about the boundaries as usual, comment on the role of the domestic resources and the importance of combining domestic and international resources into climate-compatible development implementation. So I think that was a very, very strong message yesterday. And then we have this kind of weird target in our heads. The Copenhagen summit agreed to a nebulous $100 billion a year of from some sources, but there's no real agreement on what it actually means. So that brings us to this interesting question of the role of the private sector in all of this. The Climate Policy Initiative, CPI's annual landscape report is interesting. It sort of talks about, it's the first attempt to track climate finance also in the private sector. And first of all, it says that everything goes to mitigation, everything. In the private sector, there's virtually really nothing for adaptation there. And of course, it doesn't really capture some of the big players in the game, and I think we are discussing those players a bit today, kind of institutional investors, the role of pension funds, those that have not, it's been very difficult to capture their role in climate finance or in financing climate action. And of course, no real structural transformation will happen without a key role of the private sector. We will not stay within the 2 degrees or with about without them. And of course, whenever I ask anywhere about the role of the private sector, I hear from them, what we need is predictability, long-term enabling environment, and we'll take care of the rest. Now, I hope this session gives us a little bit more meat and a little bit more interesting insights of what could we do in addition to just creating a predictable environment and long-term enabling sort of conditions. And I've been asked to inform that this session is being live streamed so that you know that you will actually be watched also outside this room. And having said all of this, I would like to turn over now to our presenter, Krista Klapp from Cicero in Norway. Cicero is a non-profit research institution based in Oslo, and Krista has also worked previously at the OECD and US EPA on a range of climate policy and negotiation issues. She has 20 minutes for her presentation, and then I have 3 discussions for 5 minutes each. Krista.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Is it okay? You can hear me? I was very energized this morning by Estonia's presentations. I hope by standing up that I can carry some of the energy over to the discussions today. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I am quite excited about thinking about how research can link better with policy decisions and how policy can take better advantage of the research thinking that's going on. So I really welcome opportunities like this conference to try to bring some of those worlds together. Skip through the boring slides. What I want to talk about in this session is 2 really diverse trends that I see. First, a lot of increased investor interest in investing in green or climate change projects or financial instruments. And secondly, what I would consider a stalemate in the negotiations on finance, where we're really locking heads about moving forward on financial commitments and tracking those commitments and defining those commitments. I don't have all the answers. I have a lot of questions. I hope you will all join me in generating some ideas along with the panel in this session for ways that we can bridge this gap. You might be wondering what Cicero is. I think it was shortly explained. It's a climate change research organization. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's based in Norway. We do a lot of work on the natural sciences, like measuring climate impact on glaciers in the northern part of Norway. But we've also started a new climate finance group because it's recognized as a really key issue that's cross-cutting across a lot of disciplines. And with that, we've also been involved in green bonds. And what I want to use the opportunity today is to talk about some of the positive trends in the private sector, because we don't often have opportunities to talk about positive movements on climate change. And it's always a good opportunity to do so. And you might be asking, why is Cicero involved in finance? Why are we involved in green bonds? And it starts with, it starts with sort of a kind of cute story, a legend, if you will, about the start of the green bond market. It starts with the father of the green bond market, who's Christopher Flensburg, who I work with on an almost daily basis. He's based at a Swedish bank called SEB, Skandinavisk Enskilda Banken in Stockholm. And the legend has it that he was afflicted with a life-threatening illness, and he was in the hospital, and he had been a lifelong banker, making money for money's sake and enjoying it. And he told his family in the hospital that if he survived this, he was going to do something useful for the world with his time. And what came out of that, he survived, thankfully, and he then took it as his life cause to champion green bonds. And his idea was to take a well-known financial instrument and use it for projects that were going to help save the world from climate change. And he convinced the World Bank in 2007 to issue the first green bond. Now, Cicero's role in this is that he called up my colleagues before I was at Cicero and said, investors are not trusting the World Bank when they say it's green. Because the World Bank also invests in coal projects. They've faced a lot of criticism about some of their sustainable development work. And while they're a very credible financial institution, some of their green projects are questioned. And so Cicero, as being a nonprofit, fairly credible environmental organization, was asked to review what the World Bank was doing and to issue a report to investors that consolidated some of the information on the environmental reporting and what types of projects were going to be invested in for this bond. And that gave the investors some sort of reassurance. So that's the short story about why I'm up here telling some positive stories about investor interest and why I'm also going to talk a lot about green bonds. So to expound a bit about what's happening on green bonds. So since 2007, sorry, I'm blocking the screen. Things trickled along and not too much happened. A few issuances happened from development banks from 2007 up until 2013. And then what happened in 2013 was a big success story in the green bond market. And there's been lots of press, lots of news articles, a recent article in The Economist about the growth of the green bond market. Basically, it more than doubled in 2013. And it's on schedule to double again in the current year, in 2014. There have been calls by President Kim from the World Bank to double the green bond market this year. We're already on track to do so. We've issued, already $9 billion US dollars of new issuance of green bond in the first quarter of this year.
Can you just define a green bond?
Yes, sorry, I should back up and say this. For the use of this presentation, a green bond is simply a bond that's applied to green projects. But I'm going to come back to what that definition is, because there's a lot of questions about what it means to be green and how green it is.
Bond issued by?
It could be issued by a government, it could be issued by a development bank, it could be issued by a corporation. So it's simply a bond that is applied to green projects. It can take a variety of different forms. I think one of the reasons why there's a lot of investor interest in this is because it's not a new product. It's not a complicated real estate investment trust that might scare off investors. But rather it's the same product just applied to green projects. But it can take a huge variety of forms, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So along with this, yes, there's a lot of new green bond issuances. You asked who's issuing them. In the beginning, for the first 5 years, it was mainly development banks, the World Bank, the IFC, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank. And now what we've seen in 2013 is at Cicero, we reviewed the first corporate green bond issuance by a real estate company in Sweden. So it's really interesting. We've done a lot of work with small companies in Sweden that are now issuing bonds. We are currently working with 3 provinces or regions in different countries, 3 municipal regions. We've reviewed one for a city. So it's quite an interesting space for a researcher to be in because we get to talk to banks all the time and we get to talk to large investors groups. And so we have some what we think are interesting insights to what's going on in so-called real world versus the negotiations. So the idea of the session is try to bridge those. Why should we care about green bonds? Well, there's just a large potential, I think, to do good for the climate with green bonds. Right now, the total bond market is something like 83 trillion, a staggering amount of money that we can't possibly fathom. 0.02% of that could possibly be called green. That's a conservative estimate using some definitional filters on bond databases. So at most, I would say that's probably what's going towards green projects. And I had to really enhance the shading there so you could even see that slice of the pie. It's so small. Just to put that into context, if I can. Yeah. If we had 0.12% of the bond market green, that's $100 billion. Now, please don't misunderstand. That is not to mean that this is going to equal the commitment in the negotiations. Not at all. Simply to give you context that 100 billion is a very small fraction of a percent of the total bond market. But green bonds are not this magic bullet. They can't solve the negotiations. And there are a lot of things to be concerned about here. So I'll talk through a little bit of the opportunities and challenges with green bonds. Well, one of the reasons why they're very interesting is that it's a very replicable, can be set up as a very simple financial instrument. So it can be issued by a variety of issuers, from governments to private sector, and it can be scalable. You can group a lot of like projects together and raise upfront capital, for example, for renewable energy projects. And they have the ability for some very interesting public-private bridges. I already mentioned we're working with a couple of municipalities to issue bonds, and they are working with their national governments for different ways to de-risk that. So we've seen some potential for some very interesting combinations for governments to get involved with the private sector here. But on the challenge side is the definition. So this is the green part of the bond. What does the green part mean? One of the things that's really challenging is that there's no agreed definition on green, much like there is no agreed definition on climate finance. And we have seen just as much investor interest in bonds that are self-labeled green as those that are receiving environmental review from CICERO or from other organizations where you might have a higher environmental integrity, or one would hope so. But so Bank of America Merrill Lynch issued a bond. They called it green. It was sold out within minutes. Same thing with the World Bank reissues green bonds under the same framework that CICERO has reviewed. So we feel that has greater environmental integrity. That's also sold out within minutes. So investors are, at this point, indifferent as to who's calling it green. They just think it's trendy to buy something that's green. So there's a variety of ways the market could develop, and right now I would call it this Wild West, where you can make up your own definition of what is green, whether it's related to climate, whether it's related to other environmental issues, and various shades from light to dark green in terms of servicing the climate. There's another challenge, which is liquidity. So right now the green bond market, as you saw, is a fraction of the total bond market, and it's not liquid enough, it's not high enough in volume to have a lot of interest by institutional investors, which is really who we want to capture. They are the big money movers in the private sector. So as I mentioned, it's not a silver bullet, but it's something we should pay attention to, and we should look at what the possibilities are to take advantage of this. Slight self-promotion. It's really just an explanation that at CICERO we are involved in reviewing green bonds, to disclose that. Just a word on why we are doing this. Well, we're researchers, but we think it's really exciting when banks call us up and ask us what our opinion is on what's green. And we feel like this is a very good use of research and a way to make that connection with what's going on in the real world outside of research. We have seen, actually, that it's shifting investment frameworks toward green. I can give the example of the African Development Bank. And in their initial green bond framework, when they came to Cicero, they had included efficiency improvements in coal-fired power plants. And we said that doesn't look very green to us in the long run. That ties up your capital in infrastructure that is not supportive of a climate solution. And they removed it from the framework. And that's not the only story I have to tell like that. I have a lot of very interesting stories where issuers have adapted what they're calling green because of conversations with us or with other people that give second opinions. So we think that, hopefully in the margins we're making a difference. Not to mention it gives us lots of good research ideas. Yes, but green bonds are not the only story. They're not the only thing I'm going to talk about. This is a slide that was presented at the Bloomberg New Energy Finance Conference. This is Michael Liebrick's slide that I'm taking advantage of. It shows a trend in total renewable energy investment worldwide and broken out by region. What's interesting is that in 2013, we saw a dip, as we did in 2012 too. So it's a question on the outset about what that means. Is that really a positive story or not? Well, if we dig a little bit deeper, what we can see is that it actually, the investment increased in China. So that's positive news. It decreased in the US. That's not so positive, but it's coupled with some trends of rapidly decreasing costs of solar PV. And also it's coupled with an increased capacity worldwide of renewable energy. So I would say that there are some positive trends underlying this as well. And the third piece of what I think is an interesting the positive trend is the talk about divestment from fossil fuel that's getting more and more traction. Investors, I think, are gaining more and more awareness of how climate change could impact their assets, also how climate change policy could ultimately impact their assets, and how changing behaviors and norms by the public could possibly change that too. Now, being aware is a little bit different than taking financial decisions based on that risk, but the trend is still there. And there's a philanthropy initiative that started in the US with the Wallace Global Fund. There's now 17 signatories to that have divested from fossil fuel in their portfolios. Now, philanthropy is a small drop in the bucket when we talk about global finance, but it's getting more attention in newspapers. Denmark's pension fund pulled out of fossil. That's the picture on the cover of Environmental Finance there. Norway's oil fund, the largest sovereign wealth fund, has not divested, but they've set up a committee to talk about the possibility of divestment this year. Australia's pension fund, University Pension Fund, was the biggest purchaser of the World Bank green bond issued in Australia, the kangaroo bond. And the TIA Craft is a New York-based teacher's pension, very large teacher's pension, is investing in green bonds now. So you can see that there are some players that are getting more active in this space. And I find all of this energizing and very interesting. And I want to take some of what's going on here and reconcile it with what's going on in the negotiations and what's going on in movements on climate policy. When we talk about investment decisions, these are typically very short-term decisions. They can be taken within months or a very short year time frame. And we're still in the situation where fossil fuel makes a profit. What I hope is that will start overlapping with where we see climate change impacts impacting those portfolios, and where we start to see policy impacts on changing the value of those fossil fuel assets. So this is my last slide. This is where I want to leave us, is where I hope we can have a conversation about what do we do with this information. I grouped it very simplistically into three areas of influence that I want to talk about. What are some positive steps forward we could take? And that's governments in the negotiations and back to researchers. So starting with governments, I would suggest a couple of things that governments could do more of, including de-risking investments that could be anywhere from issuing green bonds. I raised the idea with the US Treasury, why don't you issue a green bond? They laughed. but I'll keep poking on them. But short of issuing a green bond, there are possibilities to de-risk, to provide insurance for those. There's a whole range of things that governments could be doing to help try to get this money flowing. Pension purchases, for example, the oil fund in Norway could start purchasing green bonds. There's also a huge potential for city partnerships or municipal level partnerships. And like I mentioned, we're working in 3 countries right now with potential municipal issuers. At the negotiations level, I will also throw out some ideas here, and I don't know what the reactions will be or how feasible or plausible they are, but I would like to see, perhaps naively, a more inclusive definition of the term mobilize. There's a lot of discussion about how do you define what mobilized in the negotiating context, and I would like to see that not have a strict definition. And in fact, I wonder if we even need to define it. I wonder if we could leave it loose enough to let governments consider within their own circumstances what they can do to increase the flows of private capital. Where the negotiations, I think, should focus is where the private sector is not reaching. There's a lot of skepticism about private sector finance in the negotiations. Some of that is unfounded based on of widespread skepticism of markets. Some of that is very founded because these markets are not reaching adaptation needs. As Ari mentioned in the introduction, in CPI's latest report, the private sector investment in adaptation was negligible. That is very much a problem, and the negotiations should really focus on these areas where markets are not going to get at. And that being said, the Fast Start Finance was largely focused on mitigation, so there's a real disconnect there. I think there's a lot of opportunities for the Green Climate Fund, again, in de-risking investments, potentially bond issuance too, why not? So I'm looking forward to hearing the panel and the audience's remarks on that. And an idea that I raised yesterday in the other session on mitigation, adaptation, and finance is how do we target these middle-income countries to also generate opportunities for private sector investment? Perhaps bonds could play a role there too. So it's something I didn't write on the slide, but has been in the back of my head. I have been working with the OECD on looking at ways that finance can play a role in the 2015 agreement. And very, very strong in my mind is this idea of how do we incentivize those middle-income countries. Lastly, to come to the researchers, myself and many others in the room, what can we do to help service this and move this forward? I think there's a tremendous amount of work to be done on definitions, on what is this green part, how green is it? And I see also a strong role for researchers to improve the environmental integrity of finance. This is tied to the definitions, but it's also part of this disseminating science to investors, disseminating the environmental information to investors. So I think there's a communication role that researchers can also play here. And I'm looking forward to all of your ideas and reactions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thanks also for the very concrete proposals and sort of ideas for our consideration. At the end, it helps my task to actually jot down some things for the final report. Let's go directly to commentaries. We have 3 people. The first one will be Marie Burt from Deutsche Bank, Assistant Vice President. And I think it's better that you introduce why you're actually, what your main interest is in climate change.
Sure. Thank you. Sounds like an interesting event you guys have had. Sorry I couldn't be here for the rest of the time, but I was at a very interesting event on the carbon tracker that launching their new report this morning. So I'll just start by giving an intro about how Deutsche Bank is active in this area. So we've got 4 main divisions in Deutsche Bank, and I'm in a central management role overseeing and helping coordinate a lot of these different initiatives. So in our investment bank, there is, as you rightly point out, a growing interest in green bonds. We were one of the top structurers of green bonds on behalf of different corporate clients and multilaterals. And also, so that's a very encouraging and interesting focus within the investment bank. Then in our asset wealth management business, so this is managing money and investing it on behalf of pension funds, large insurance companies, high net worth individuals. There's a growing focus on ESG, environmental, social, and governance integration. So incorporating this data on environmental practices of companies, what their social practices are, and looking at the data provided by companies like MSCI or Sustainalytics, and incorporating that into your investment decision making on which stocks to buy, which bonds to buy for countries even, and also looking at property and the real estate sector where there's a growing focus on green buildings. Also within our asset wealth management business, we have several specialized funds that invest in renewable energy and energy efficiency, and those are structured funds that are public-private partnerships, and that's one of the other very promising and encouraging ways to leverage public money with private sector investment and to actually get things happening on the ground. So the Global Climate Partnership Fund is one of those funds, and it has public sector investments from the UK government, recently the German government, KfW, and some other multilaterals, and then has in 2012 had its first private sector investor, a German pension fund, invested 30 million into that fund, and that fund provides credit lines to local banks in emerging markets, so a bank in Chile or in Brazil or in India or in Turkey, Ukraine, places like that, and then those banks then weren't doing anything on green investment and then provide loans to companies and individuals on the ground. So this is action, this is happening, this is money that is flowing from north to south. And that's a very good structure because that public money will absorb any sort of will take a first loss on if there are any issues that come up in any of the projects on the ground. There haven't been any projects, and the fund has been profitable and is returning its expected return to its public and private investors. So that's one of the de-risking instruments that the Green Climate Fund could do more of, because there is growing interest by institutional investors, not only in incorporating ESG into their choice of stocks or and those types of investments, but also into what they call alternatives, so real assets, so real estate, infrastructure, power generation, these types of specialized funds. And that's an encouraging area where more can be done. And it's for the sort of the NGO sort of community is a couple of messages I would say is that more pressure and more encouragement as individuals even on your pension funds, asking them how they're incorporating these issues into their investment decision making. Are they asking their investment managers, i.e. us, to do this? Are they setting up mandates to invest in low carbon technology? Because there is some alignment. The returns are long term. Once a plant is built, a power plant is built, it provides some regular returns. And how are those pension funds playing a role in policy debates? Then the message perhaps to when you're working with developing countries is I know there's a lot of work, and it's great work to develop low carbon strategies, but you've got to turn that work into investable projects for funds like ours and others to invest into, because there is a real gap between we have money that we want to put to work, but there is still a gap between investable projects and our projects actually ready. Do they have a good business plan? Do they have basically a good business plan for us to work with them to invest into? So those are translating the investment strategies into actual projects that funds like ours can invest into.
Thank you. This comes over and over again. Actually, there's money, but not enough bankable projects. We hear this all the time, so that's also a very interesting comment from a private banker. Now let's turn to Amalie Amin from E3G, Associate Director, leads the International Climate Finance Program. focusing on shaping the international and national financial ecosystem for catalyzing and delivering transformational change.
Thank you. Yes, a small task we set ourselves at E3G. So yes, I'm just a little bit of background how I'm trying to deliver on this. I'm working in, or our team, we're working in countries with governments, with those who are either financial decision makers or trying to persuade the financial decision makers of the importance of putting public finance, domestic public budgets into climate, green, low carbon, whatever type of terminology you want to use. And we've, with support of CDKN, done some really interesting work in Chile, Colombia and Peru, actually. And unfortunately, I didn't bring copies of the reports, which was a mistake, which is identifying and highlighting some of the challenges national governments are facing, particularly with a fairly fragmented international climate finance agenda, but also a fragmented policy framework. And so I'd like to just pick up on Krista's presentation and also some points that Murray made and say, I think it's great that we've got these green bond issuances happening, and I think the MDBs have been doing some interesting stuff in, putting forward, putting a greater proportion of their portfolio into green or climate-friendly projects. Frankly, I think they should be putting all of their portfolios into low carbon and resilient development investments, as all public money should be, as we are transitioning, as we need to transition to a low carbon and resilient economy globally. All money, all investment needs to be going in that direction. And so I think, when we think here about 0.02%, I mean, this clearly is a fraction. I mean, it's great, it's good that it's happening, and I think Christopher and others like him and, the work of Krista is, really pioneering and raising awareness. But it's not even the tip of the iceberg. The 99.08% is going into non-green investments. And so how do we tip that balance? And I think, the way I see it in terms of, private investors see risk as the key issue that determines where they put their money. And at the moment, when we think about the private sector, there are, they're obviously very, they're certainly not homogenous, a whole great range of different actors at play. And when you think about those who are affected by climate change, climate impacts, there are clear climate risks now that are starting to be taken on board by many in the private sector. And those companies, even though I think, and I think the CPI work is excellent, but I think in terms of how much finance is going into adaptation measures, apparently it isn't, the private sector doesn't like to reveal to competitors, to the public, to others, actually how climate risk is impacting on them, because that could reduce their shareholder value and, actually be perceived very negatively about their future business model. So there probably is a lot more investment going into adaptation from the private sector than actually the figures imply. And we see a number of companies coming out, companies like Unilever, who are really showing a lot of leadership. Companies like Unilever, which have a global supply chain, they understand that climate change is creating huge risks to that supply chain. If they can't be producing products in countries that are becoming increasingly vulnerable, then they are effectively losing their business model, needs to change. And we're seeing a lot of interesting action there. But then we also have the private sector that actually are contributing to climate change, and I guess particularly the fossil fuel industry. And whilst we see some really interesting initiatives like the Carbon Tracker initiative that talks about a carbon bubble, and I think it's excellent, it's an excellent initiative. I think what we also hear, and I think Exxon came out fairly recently on this, if Paris fails, if we don't see an agreement that is considered credible, that is considered as ambitious as is required to shift the world onto a trajectory that's ideally towards 2 degrees. If Paris does not deliver on that kind of agreement, then effectively the fossil fuel industry and the institutional investors whose money currently is invested in high carbon investments will say, okay, we don't think governments are committed to this agenda, so it's business as usual. And to a certain extent that happened with Copenhagen. A lot of institutional investors were looking at Copenhagen thinking, okay, if they come up with a cap on carbon, then we know, and that's a 2050 cap, then we know that in the next 40 years, we have to be transitioning out of high carbon. It didn't happen, and so it's business as usual. So I think in terms of how do we get the 99.08% actually redirecting, I think the UNFCCC has a really critical role in that respect. I think someone said in the previous session, because I don't want to talk for too long, but someone said in the previous session that that the UNFCCC needs to catalyse domestic action. I think, yes, up to a point, but I think it's more about codifying and locking in existing domestic action. And I think where we are at the moment, we're in a very different position from where we were in Copenhagen. Many countries, particularly in the developing world, particularly in many regions, Latin America and Africa, many in Asia, they are seriously in the process of trying to move to a low-carbon economy. They're not there yet. They're not putting their budgets behind this yet in significant forms, but that's the direction of travel. And so I think, again, that needs to be locked in to a certain extent, and it, to me, undermines the importance of the Paris Agreement in terms of ensuring that all public finance domestically and then all international flows, particularly private, actually are then locked into that low-carbon trajectory.
Thank you. And let's go directly to the last respondent, Jonathan Grant from PwC, on secondment to the Green Investment Bank, I believe. So please, you might want to explain and expand on that a little bit as well.
Thanks, Ali. Yes, I'm currently on secondment to the Green Investment Bank, but today I'm wearing my PwC hat. And I sit in the Sustainability and Climate Change team along with Sam and others. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things this morning. The first was some recent work I've been involved in on project bonds, and then some of the lessons from other climate finance mechanisms. Now, in terms of project bonds, I think there's a theory that there is limited bank finance available for low carbon investment, and there's a theory that bonds can help to move institutional money and provide long-term debt to low carbon investment at a large scale. And I think bonds do have great potential, but there are particular characteristics of the way bonds work that do make it difficult in terms of investment in developing countries. And I also think, the analysis that I've done has been looking at whether you could use project bonds to mobilise investment in projects in the UK. Now, I think bonds are really only sort of successful if you're looking at mature technologies. So onshore wind would be considered a mature technology. So you couldn't issue a bond for sort of some innovation or marine power or something like that, or even CCS probably. They're typically, because they're quite expensive to issue, they're quite complicated to issue. It's really only worth doing if they're at large scale. So the project bonds that we've looked at in the US are typically in the range of between $500 million US to $1 billion, and that equates to a project size of around 250 to 650 megawatts. So that's a single project. It's a very large project. Now, if you don't have a single large project, maybe you can aggregate a bunch of smaller ones, but then you've got challenges of how do you manage the performance of that portfolio. And in the UK, at the moment, there are only 4 sites, onshore wind sites, that are consented at that scale. So there are not many projects in the UK that would sort of fit that bond model. To get them issued, you need to have a sort of a good credit rating, an investment grade credit rating, and a solid backer. So sort of BBB minus is generally considered to be, investment grade. And one of the challenges over here is that utilities, the ratings of utilities in the big six in the UK is generally a bit worse than in the US. And really, I think that people are interested in bonds. When they're interested in bonds, they're interested in who's issuing them, rather than necessarily what the underlying asset is. So the Unilever bond that you mentioned, and that the EIB has issued green bonds as well. But really, people are they don't care about the green. They're just interested in who's issuing them. So bonds can have a role, but they have to overcome some of those challenges. The other issue is that, in theory, that banks aren't providing project finance, and the sort of longer term debt that these renewables projects demand. And Basel III regulations would suggest that that's the case, and therefore bonds could play a role there to fill that gap. But I haven't seen that recently in the research we've done. We're seeing, in fact, many of the sort of conventional European banks are coming back into the renewables markets. They're providing sufficiently long-term debt at sufficiently low cost that it's easier to go to a bank to get project finance than it is to issue a bond. So I think that green bonds have potential, but there are real challenges, and there are challenges for green bonds in the UK. And if you put that in the developing country context, that makes it even harder. And one final point about green bonds is that some people say, just don't call them green. Like, people will always be, you call them a green bond or a climate bond, so some people will be turned on about it, by that. But the vast majority will be suspicious that there's something dodgy going on. Like, why do you need to call it a climate bond? Is it going to have a poorer financial performance, but it does wonderful things for the environment? So if we just stick to calling them project bonds, maybe that would help. So now I've been involved over the years in various other sort of mildly disappointing climate finance mechanisms, like the Clean Development Mechanism and the European Emissions Trading Scheme, and the voluntary carbon market. And I think there are lots of lessons that can be learned from those experiences that are really relevant to the climate negotiations and all this excitement around climate finance and the Green Climate Fund. And I think it's sad that we've put the CDM away and said, oh, well, that's a Kyoto thing, that's last year's news. I think some of those lessons are, certainly for the CDM, that the complexity of the rules at the beginning was such that it was really off-putting. I mean, it was so challenging to come up with baselines and define additionality that it got off to a really slow start. And I think we should try and avoid that this time round. With the EU ETS, I think the first mistake was that there was too much free allocation for too long, and that really shielded companies from feeling the full price signal from the cost of carbon. Obviously, the level of ambition isn't there in the EU ETS, which is why the price is just hovering around €5 today. But there's even a lack of clarity about the purpose of the EU ETS. So is it set a cap, or is it to drive low carbon investment? And I think, well, there are two. Depending on your view there, it would suggest different forms of ways of amending or improving that system. In terms of the voluntary carbon market, well, what lesson can you learn from that? Well, probably is that you can't rely on goodwill for very long. You really have to mobilise the conventional investor to get behind climate finance. And one last one, the NER 300, which was a funding programme for innovation in renewables and CCS, it's an EU-wide programme, is that you need a hell of a lot of money. They've not been able to get a carbon capture and storage project off the ground yet, and one of the problems has been a lack of money. So, for me, the problem is around lack of ambition by by governments in particular, not by investors. And you said, Ari, that we shouldn't just say clear long-term signals. We had to be more specific than that. So I'll try and give some examples of what those clear long-term signals might be. I mean, things like long-term power purchase agreements that governments stand behind and stand behind and stand behind and don't just pull because it gets difficult or it looks a bit expensive. I think clarity around price signals in carbon markets are another. And my favourite option for reform in the EU ETS is to introduce an auction reserve price, which doesn't seem very popular with many others, partly because it would limit price fluctuations, which many of the traders don't like. Another clear long-term signal would be around the role of CERs, so that CERs are fine in the EU ETS, but there's now a limit, and we've reached that limit, and so there's no further demand for CERs, and so there is no real significant investment in projects. If governments are really serious about the role of the CDM, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be rejuvenated by a new deal, they need to be clear about the long-term demand for those types of credit. So that's my 5 minutes there.
Thanks very much. It's good that you also brought this back to the magic word of carbon prices and carbon markets, because that's always, we can't really envisage any sort of major transition without it. And this always reminds me of these sort of poor chaps in developing countries who've been in these carbon trading CDM schemes for years, preparing themselves for MRV, and then they're completely frustrated. They put all that effort and money into them, and now they can't sell a thing and there's no revenue. So to build that trust again with any new scheme is going to be complicated and demanding, and really requires, I mean, I've seen so many really unhappy entrepreneurs in emerging economies as kind of as victims of this sort of false expectations. So I think a lot of food for thought. Now I can already see a number of hands. Let's go there. Let's text that side first. 3 hands. I know who they are. Then I'll go to the 4th one afterwards, and then I know your 4 and 5 and 6.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. My question is related to the most recent booming of green bonds registered in the very last 2 years. And my question is how much this is related to the market failure of clean development mechanism and EU ETS related instruments.
Not at all.
Not at all.
Let's collect.
But, and the second question is, to what extent then green bonds and this kind of other mechanism might work together and be complementary in a new system?
Right behind you, next one.
Yeah, Carl Schultz with, hello? Carl Schultz with the Higher Ground Foundation. I'd like to bring up this issue of adaptation finance. I mean, I think some good points were made that there isn't a lot of activity, certainly not on the private sector. We're working to develop a platform for a climate vulnerability reduction credit. And the constant question that people ask and we ask ourselves is, where's the demand for private intervention, in particular in developing countries, for this? When you see, I mean, I'm going to lead this a bit. You see in the mitigation side, and I've been involved in that set of markets, a lot of critical policy interventions and subsidies that have led to that trajectory, including the trajectory for investment in renewables and what have you. What mechanisms do you think policymakers need to develop that can mobilize intervention in adaptation finance by the private sector? Ideally, let's look at developing countries that's not centrally planned, but where more agents are involved, which is what has happened in the mitigation markets.
Okay, then I think Harvey, at the back, that was the 3rd hand, and then you, after these answers, we'll get to you.
Oh,
yeah, yeah. I could sort of see in which sequence the hands went up.
Thanks, Harry. Henry Derwent from Climate Strategies. One short point, one slightly longer one. The short point is, I think it would be great if researchers in the bottom left bubble could be expanded to include more work on disclosure, because I think that disclosure through disclosure, I'll just shout. I think that disclosure through accounts of risks and activity is actually slowly making progress. That sounds slightly insulting to the Carbon Disclosure Project to say it's slow, but it has been slow. But it is getting better, and I think it's as much of a factor which could impact on companies as the others that you've mentioned. The slightly longer point is that is around the word investable, to use Murray Burt's term for it. The issue that none of us, I think, are able to get our arms around is what actually constitutes a potential change to investability that is within the grasp of governments and the carbon finance initiatives and institutions that we have. One of the numbers that I'd always love to see, and the IEA have provided at least the basis for this, is an assessment of the amount of energy investment which is needed, but which is not at the moment investable, not productive of market-compatible returns at the moment. And then that opens up the question of what could the public sector do to plausibly change the returns by de-risking guarantees and so forth, which would actually make a difference. They're not magic wands. There are certain areas where private investors will say, well, no matter what governments do to it, I just don't want to be there. But on the other hand, there's quite a lot where you could, in principle, increase the amount of investment that's possible. The GCF appears at the moment to have comprehensively dropped that ball. The discussions, I'm one of the alternate private sector representatives in the observer community of the GCF. They all looked at the idea of guarantees and sort of said, ooh, frightening looking instrument here, a lot of risk associated with it, don't want anything to do with it. Maybe we'll get further with that, but at the moment it doesn't look very good. But an analysis by research of what actually the sort of penumbra around investable, presently investable is, which identifies how much more investment that we need, could be achieved for an increment of government de-risking. That's the issue I think we should concentrate on.
Thanks. We'll do the other three hands later. Let's do a round now. Krista, if you could start.
Yes, some good comments and questions. I think around there are a couple of interacting questions about what the public sector can do, what developing countries can do to bring in investment and adaptation, or more private sector investment, or increase investability, if that's our term now. I can give a couple different ideas on this. One is what I always think of a striking example of a developing country getting very usefully involved in a renewable energy investment project. It's the case of Mali. And Mali may have other things on their mind, but one thing they did in terms of renewable energy is the Malian government backed the investments in renewable energy from the Clean Technology Fund. That's a really interesting case of a developing country government providing risk insurance for a World Bank CTF project. And I always think that's really interesting and unexpected from the Malian government. So there's, I think that's one example of something that could perhaps be replicated other places if it can happen in Mali. The other thing that I think that needs to be tapped into is the national development banks. I think they can play a really strong role in guiding investments into their countries, and in guiding private investment into their countries. And also just to say that there's a broad role of the international development banks as well, and the World Bank green bond and some of the other development banks green bonds also include adaptation projects. It's not their main component. Most of the green bonds that Cicero has been reviewing have been largely focused on renewable energy projects and energy efficiency projects. But that's not to say that adaptation has been completely excluded. It hasn't. There are adaptation projects in developing countries that are now being financed through development bank green bonds. So there's a couple different roles. There's roles at the national government level in developing countries and de-risking. There's also that role for national development banks and then the international financial institutions as well.
Yeah, I'll make a couple of comments. The first on whether green bonds can complement the CDM and other mechanisms. I'm sure they should be able to, because they're just another type of debt. And so a project developer would need to raise debt in order to make the investment in the project. And the carbon would be one revenue stream. Hopefully there'll be other revenue streams as well, which would pay for the cost of the coupon. In terms of how the private sector can intervene more and or finance more adaptation, I think that sort of on a case-by-case basis, you see companies making investments to sort of improve the resilience of their own infrastructure, but sort of broader adaptation finance, I think, is really challenging for the private sector because the revenue model just isn't really there. So in sort of flood defence, collective flood defence, I think that's a really sort of challenging thing for the private sector to get involved in, but maybe the insurance companies can play a role. And then finally to Henry's question about needing more disclosure, I think there is a lot of disclosure at the moment, and I'm not sure that all this disclosure, efforts by the CDP and others, is really changing things. We've had a lot of corporate climate disclosure over time. I think it's critical that we have it. I'm not sure it's created a massive step change in the way companies think about or invest in relation to climate change.
Amalie?
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly on the adaptation in the private sector, I think, as I said earlier, I think the private sector is investing. They're not admitting to it. But I think also in many developing countries, it's a bit of a myth that the private sector it wouldn't want to invest if they understood the risks and understood the vulnerabilities. As a sort of anecdote, I was involved in programming the pilot program on climate resilience in the Caribbean and Jamaica in particular, and we were looking at different risks. We're looking at coastal erosion. The government doesn't own the coast; it's owned by the hotels, who, and they're all private sector. Agriculture sector, small farmers, they're all private. They're not government. They're not public organisations. So the role of microinsurance, an important mechanism to assist them. Whichever sector you look at, actually. Depending on the structure of the economy, of course, but it's very likely the private sector, if they understood the risks, would actually want to invest and would either do it themselves or demand government put in place some form of either public support or regulations. Regulations, for example, for the housing sector, for different sectors. In terms of GCF, and Henry made the point that the GCF will not provide de-risking, more innovative de-risking instruments such as guarantees. Well, I think that's actually hopefully not the case. I'm currently a member of the private sector advisory group to the Green Climate Fund, and we had our first meeting a couple of weeks ago, and it was very clear that for the GCF to be effective in mobilising the private sector, it needs to go beyond what the current instruments that the GCF can provide in terms of grants and concessional loans. But I think one of the sort of nuances around that is that the Green Climate Fund can provide a grant and concessional loan, but it can provide that to an intermediary, which could be a multilateral, a regional, a bilateral, or a national development bank, or a private company, and that intermediary can then structure that into a guarantee, can structure that into insurance mechanism, a whole range of innovative approaches. So even though the sort of the governing instrument implies that grants, concession loans will be the first instruments, I think it's highly likely the GCF will be able to provide a whole range of de-risking instruments, and I think that will be part of the discussions coming up in the next year, in the next couple of meetings this year. So I'd probably stop there. I think.
Do you want to?
I think there are, well, what is investable? There was a good CMCI report that that DEC commissioned and a number of finance sector players, including us, contributed to. So I'd recommend that to sort of understand it. But there's a whole range of risks that we have to look at and that have to be addressed. And so maybe a country like Uganda has a feed-in tariff already, but when come election time, that money somehow makes its way into the election campaign for the government, or whether the local utility is actually going to pay your bills and pay your bills on time, because they are going to be the off-taker for your renewable energy project. So, but that's where you can provide some de-risking. So we came up with the Get Fit idea, and now have applied that in Uganda with the help of UK, Norway, Germany, and the Commission to provide a feed-in tariff top-up to the local feed-in tariff to help bridge the gap and to provide that certainty that the local project developers will get paid, will get their incentive paid. So that's one type of instrument. And for the government's perspective, that was probably a grant. But then that grant is then being used to help encourage and provide a regulatory enhancement, which is now going to transform Uganda's power grid from 100% fossil to 20% renewables over the next few years. So that's a great. And there are other ideas. There's credit enhancements. We could do something on local exchange rates for currencies that aren't traded very much. Role of project preparation facilities to help to overcome that early stage project development gap, and the development banks do have a key role, and they are doing a lot, but from time to time we do see that they are almost shooting ourselves in the foot because they're over subsidizing or providing they're providing zero interest or very low interest loans, and that crowds the private sector out, and so they have to have more of an incentive or requirement to use their funding in a smarter way, and that may take a little bit more time to develop a project rather than just getting a loan out the door. So you have to look at the incentives that the individual loan officers face. On disclosure, I think it has shifted, and it's the raw material now that responsible investors are incorporating, and we've got a big effort because there's lots of data sources, and so pulling that in, there is an issue that all of these reporting requirements are a pain to fill out as one who has to fill out or be involved in helping fill out Deutsche Bank's disclosure to CDP and others. So there should be some alignment to what are the material issues, but if you look at an initiative in the US, this Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, and they are coming up with what are the material ESG sustainability factors for different sectors. And Michael Bloomberg and the former head of the SEC have recently just joined SASB, so that's showing that it's got some real oomph behind it, and that is helping, because these are questions that investors ask then companies. What are you doing on risk X and Y, and that's helpful to the overall piece. Adaptation, I don't have the right answer, but I had a slight involvement with a World Economic Forum report on adaptation, which I think cited your scheme or idea, but somebody has to take your idea forward, and there are a couple of ideas out there in the adaptation world, but somebody's got to really apply them, and the role of companies and supply chains and helping them reducing their resiliency, that companies are looking at that, and they're having to disclose what they're doing, so there should be something there. I don't have the answer, but there should be something there. Somebody's got to take it forward and experiment a bit more.
Thanks. I have noted 5 hands, and I think it's probably better to do them in a row, and so pen's ready, take note of people's questions. I think, Dara, you were the last one on that side, and then we go here.
Thanks. Dara Conway, Climate Focus. Thanks for an excellent presentation. I think that was really good food for thought. I wanted to pick up on the issue of measurability of impacts, and I think you touched on it, Krista, with regard to measuring what is a green bond. but also with regard to measuring when public finance is actually leveraging private finance. And we've been working with financial institutions to measure the climate impacts of their whole investment portfolio and the whole investment chains. And so you say, there's been institutional investors, as you say, which have been, say, divesting from fossil fuels, which is kind of easy to say, well, okay, we don't invest directly in the coal company. But the more complex issue of what's the total impact along our whole investment chain becomes a lot more complex. And I'd just be interested to hear the panel's views, especially with representatives of the financial sector, and in terms of, I think, Henry's doubt of, what's the usefulness of disclosure, how useful that kind of initiative is, and whether we should see more of that, or whether this specific measurement is in the end, not crucial.
Thank you. I'm Tom Brewer from ICTSD in Geneva. A quick factual footnote and then a quick question. The factual footnote is, you probably are all aware that a few days ago Stanford University in California announced that it would be divesting its coal-related stocks. This is a tiny fraction of its $68 billion endowment, of course, but it is a reminder of two things. The first is that if you take the 20 or 30 richest universities in the US, including some state universities, by the way, their endowments probably would equal more than $1 trillion. That's off the top of my head. The second thing is that there is a movement going on. It was started actually at Swarthmore College a year or two ago now, putting pressure on universities to divest fossil fuel stocks. The question is, do any of you have any impression of sort of the size, the potential for these universities to switch into, quote, green investments, what the size might be, and maybe some of the special challenges? But I have a hunch that over the next, I'll say, 1 to 10 years, that this could really mount up to a significant opportunity.
Axel?
Yes, two questions. The first one relates to, we have the green bond and we have projects. What is the difference of the projects from business as usual investments that would be financed by very normal bonds? And because otherwise we might get the backlash of the environmental community saying you do some new greenwashing here. Second one, we have in the developing world now the NAMAs coming up, at least in a lot of feasibility studies, less in actual implementation. How would you see the role of the private financial industry in supporting the implementation of concrete policy instruments like GetFit? I think is a perfect example for a combination of modern financial engineering and NAMAs, but do you see any way how to ramp up this?
Simon?
Thanks. I want to ask a naive question with a sting in the tail. The naive question is that I'm really struggling to see the answer to the question to which bonds is the answer. Okay, and the sting in the tail is, I think if you did answer that question, we would be having a very different conversation depending on what kind of bond we're talking about and who's issuing it and for what purpose. From listening to you, bonds are a way to finance governments in their own currency or in foreign exchange. They're a way for companies to fund projects. They're a way for development banks to capitalize themselves, and maybe other reasons. And in each of those cases, there are alternative ways of funding them. And I would like to understand better why bonds are the right answer for different funding purposes. In the UK, we're having a big debate about whether the government should capitalise its own development bank, actually internally, but also on the development side. And the Select Committee has just done an inquiry into the future of UK development finance. And one of the big ideas is there should be a UK development bank. But we also have the Commonwealth Development Corporation and various other options. So I'm a bit lost, and I think the reason is that I don't understand enough about this to understand what the purpose is of these different kinds of bonds for different purposes. But my sting is that I think if I did, I would want to have a different conversation on each topic.
And there was Carlo, I think, the last one. next slide.
Thank you. I'm very interested in financial schemes that can help to nudge things in the direction of green growth. And I have two questions, one more short-term, one more long-term. The short-term question is, I hear by hearsay that this project bond initiative that the EU is running as a pilot scheme, let's say, is not very strongly supported by the German government, to use diplomatic language. Do you have intelligence pointing in the same direction, and do you think it would be worth to make an effort to perhaps further improve the German government's position on this? And that's a pretty short-term thing, and this stuff is up and running, and there's stuff to be done. The longer-term thing is the governor of the People's Bank of China, the Chinese central bank, gave a talk during the financial crisis about the long-term lessons and perspectives from this crisis. And he thoughtfully and strongly advocated an expanding role of special drawing rights and the IMF in the global financial systems for his own reasons. And then there's people like Joe Stiglitz and others who say, well, why doesn't the IMF issue SDRs strategically to fund what Michael yesterday called a strategic investment? And you could imagine the Green Climate Fund, you can imagine the World Bank, you can imagine European project bonds. There's many things of that kind. Do you follow that kind of conversation? Do you think it's worth for people like us to somehow engage in this stuff?
Is your question related to this? No. Okay, let's do one more, and I think we'll have a round, because then we have 10 minutes left for proper answers.
Thank you, Richard Lorch. Yesterday, UniFI issued a report on sustainability metrics, and it was quite clear that a lot of companies are not really joined up in their evidence gathering about what they're doing or the outcomes of their projects. They're very good at putting projects together, but understanding the outcomes and performance is weak, shall we say, or there's room for improvement. So I guess it's a comment or a question of how can the research base be more involved in establishing the credibility of a green bond in terms of its actual performance and outcome, not its hypothetical one, but what actually happens at the sort of the back end, and then feed that back into a system so it doesn't turn into the problem that Axel described.
Good, thank you. That was a long list of interesting questions, and I suggest we go the other way.
Yeah,
So
fair enough. Measurability. There's a strong growth in the area of impact investing. So this is where investors are looking for an environmental or social benefit as well as a financial benefit. And that financial return could be market-based, or an investor could choose to give up and have a non-market return and lower rate of return. And our Global Climate Partnership Fund is an example of an impact investing, because our part of the mandate is that it has a minimum threshold for 20% emission reductions, and it's been achieving significantly above that up to now. But so there is a focus, and it isn't just an environmental one; it's a strong social one as well. So there is an industry and the Global Impact Investing Network, and they've got tools on their website for measuring investments, and a large number of specialized private equity firms that invest in bottom of the pyramid type schemes to improve employment, and what are actually the benefits of that. Governments are increasingly interested in impact investing as a way to bring more innovation and more capital to various social problems. So the UK has been really leading that. So measuring the performance and what the outcomes is important, and it isn't just driven by mission investors at the foundations and the like, but also mainstream investors have said we want to see more measurement of what the benefits are, so that we can report to our pension fund beneficiaries about what we're doing, what the benefits we're creating with your money, not just the harm or just not just that we're making you money and that's fine. The divestment campaign is quite interesting, because it is companies are going to have to put their money into something else. But it is one tool in the pocket, and it can also have a range of schemes if you're looking at fossil fuel. So you could just be investing in companies that in fossil fuel companies that have good have top of the quartile environmental and social performance. So that's sort of one. There's a range of schemes that you could be doing, but just having more responsible investment, so it isn't just a divest, and so Harvard has joined the Principles for Responsible Investing, and I think that's encouraging from a wider perspective and getting more investors onto that scheme and system, and thinking about engaging and setting long-term mandates and actively engaging companies to improve their performance is important. There is a risk that green bonds are just sort of a business as usual, and some bonds you could argue, I think, quite strongly that they are just a marketing scheme, but I think that's why people are turning to third parties to provide some external assurance, and the green bonds principles that we and other banks have signed up to has the aim of creating some sort of standards to that, so that it isn't just a business as usual. To the point of green bonds, it's a bond is debt, and the flip side is equity. So those are the two tools that you have to have, and any project will have some mix of debt and equity. And green bonds started by multilateral banks and just as their use of proceeds, but they need to raise money to then lend, and it's a signal of their intent, and it's helped grow this market. And the corporates are now getting into it. But then the third tier, which Jonathan spoke about, is project bonds linked to a specific project. So when you buy a Unilever green bond, you're just buying a Unilever bond. But if you buy a renewable energy bond, you're buying a bond linked to that explicitly to that project. And the benefit of that is at a project level is to get it might be cheaper funding. So somebody has developed that project, and you can do that now in the UK. You can buy, and this is not an investment recommendation, that you can buy into a renewable energy farms, and so project developers have raised the money, built the farm, and are going to have to be paying that back to whoever they've lent it from. If you go in and provide your capital, you're providing it at perhaps a lower rate. It's still a good rate of return for you, and then the developer is able to go and use that money for new projects. And that's sort of the idea is if you've built for a project bond, you've financed it somehow, but then it's to go to other investors who have a different risk return profile, because once a project is built, it's lower risk and it can be appropriately held by a long-term investor. Whereas at pre-development stage, it's much riskier. Special drawing rights, I think there have been ideas about that. I haven't been following it lately, but it was a few years ago that people were talking about Stieglitz and others were raising this, and if it's coming back, I think we need all the tools in the basket, and if this it helps countries raise more capital specifically for green ends, that's great, but I think they've probably got a lot of tools already. It's just the political will to some extent. I'm a bit alarmed to hear about not encouraging news about the EU out in German's perspective on the project bonds initiative, because that is it provides a credit enhancement for EU-based infrastructure projects, not just renewable energy, and it's an encouraging scheme. So that should happen, and we need to be having more schemes like that to provide credit enhancements to projects. NAMA to feasibility ramp up, yes. We just need to Get Fit is the first funded implemented NAMA, and we just need to get all the other projects similar and get example projects and have various people who, like us, who are involved in funding projects to then make that NAMA come to life, because there is strong economic reasons for countries to do green growth beyond an international agreement.
Thank you. So quickly, I think in terms of the universities, I think I don't know the answer to your question, but I think to get, at the moment it's like, well, we'll do no harm, but to get all of that flowing into, well, we'll actively do good would be fantastic, and it'd be great to see that as the next phase of the campaign and in the US and elsewhere. In terms of the I'm not sure I'm doing these in the right order, but the NAMAs, I think, I mean, it's great to hear that the Get Fit's been called a NAMA now. No, it should be. I mean, I personally think, NAMA's great. If a country wants to call it a NAMA, fine. If it wants to call it a sectoral agreement, it wants, whatever. I mean, we're now talking about nationally determined contributions, so, how many NAMAs does it take to make an NDC, So I'm being a little bit flippant. I'm being a little bit flippant, but I think, the reality of the situation is that governments, if they want to transform sectors, they need to work with their private sector. They need to put in place appropriate policy and regulatory frameworks. They need to engage their private sector on that so that the private sector understands where the incentives are, and they also need to be looking at removing disincentives, which could include, for example, fossil fuel subsidies. In terms of, I'll come back to Simon Maxwell. I was going to say Stephen Maxwell. I'll come back to your question at the end because I particularly like to respond to that. But I think the point on, yes, I mean, I think we need to think about all financial institutions need to be considering how best they are responding to the challenges we face. I know the IMF, there was a lot of activity within the IMF before the financial crisis looking at its role in particularly looking around resilience and how to help particularly vulnerable countries, what that might mean, in terms of their risk management frameworks. I mean, the financial crisis happened and, of course, all of that sort of went out the window because suddenly the IMF had a lot more demand for its business than it had prior to the crisis. So, but I think, it's all financial institutions need to be integrating climate risk, low carbon objectives into their businesses. Otherwise, we're only just sort of tackling a small part of the international ecosystem. In terms of green bonds, I think they're good because they're raising awareness, but I think yes, it needs to go beyond bond issuance. Corporate bonds, it's great to hear some corporate green bonds are coming forward. Project bonds, the point about Germany, I think Germany's concern is probably beyond that instrument, but it's more, should EU member states be putting their balance sheets behind the Commission's? And I guess, given what's happened with the Eurozone, there's issues in Germany that go beyond that as an instrument, which is a shame, but it's a much bigger concern. In terms of, and I think then the other key instrument is securitization, and that's why I wanted to come back to your point, Simon. I was involved in looking at the role of the Green Investment Bank within the UK. I was leading on that in DEC at the time, and we did a lot of quite in-depth research discussions with the whole range of investors across the spectrum in terms of, in particular, what was required for increasing scale of investment in offshore wind in particular. So in the case of the offshore wind sector, what we see and what we have seen is that it's pretty much all the investments have been off utility balance sheets. There was one fully commercial bank project that was progressing for some time. It had, I think, something like 15, 20 banks involved. It couldn't close. The offshore wind projects are so big that they dwarf a commercial bank's balance sheet. So even that big syndication just didn't go forward. And so in the end, I think Centrica came into that project and it finally got off. But what we were looking at, what is the capacity of the utilities to go beyond round one, offshore wind, round one, round two, and into round three? And I guess what we discovered is that most of the utilities were in a position to have one offshore wind farm on their balance sheet, one in construction phase, but to go beyond that, then they were going to bring on a lot of risk onto their balance sheets that, in fact, some of the credit rating agencies were saying would not be acceptable. They would downgrade their credit rating, which as a utility, that would be, catastrophic. So what we saw in the case of what the Green Investment Bank could do was how to take the assets once they were constructed, once they'd operated for maybe 1 or 2 years, so the level of risk had been reduced, and how to flip those into the capital markets into institutional investors. What would be the role of a green investment bank in securitizing those assets and putting some public money into risk, mitigating some of the risks around that? That is different, very different to bond issuance. There's a big debate around should the green investment bank be issuing bonds, and I think, and my Secretary of State at the time, Chris Huhne, was very keen on that agenda. That would be more about raising relatively cheap capital for the GIB to make investments, as opposed to doing sort of securitization. So, yeah.
Did you look at taking an equity stake?
Yes, we looked at that. That wasn't seen as the most favoured instrument. The utilities. A key message we got from the whole range of investors, if you can sort out the refinancing challenge, and not just utilities, actually commercial banks. A lot of commercial banks had a lot of onshore wind investments on their balance sheet that they couldn't sell into the capital markets unless they saw them at a loss. And so for them, they weren't prepared to go into the next round and the scale of investment required. And they were saying if you can sort out the debt problem, the equity will be there. So, yeah.
Okay, let's get into that. We're eating over our lunch, into our lunch. We are late, but we started late, so let's have some concluding words first from Jonathan, and then finally our presenter.
I'll just pick up on where Murray and Emily left off on bonds, and to get to the question, and I agree with everything that you said on their role, and I think the question that they're the answer to is, how do we get institutional investors to support the low carbon transition? And they're the big guys, the pension funds, the endowments. I think that's really what that's what bonds are the answer to. Now, just to touch on a couple of others, Axel, you asked about how do we know that these green bonds are additional? And I think that you're coming at it from the right place in the sense that you don't want green bonds merely to be a marketing exercise. They need to be substantial, and there need to be, real green and clearly sustainable projects that sit behind them. But I would worry if there was too much time spent worrying about additionality. Yeah. I mean, it sort of kills the CDM debate. And I'm just would be encouraged to see more and more bonds going into low carbon investment. If you want to call them green bonds or climate bonds, then great. But I think what we need is more investment in general. Which brings me to my last point about, in response to Tom, that if you divest your coal stocks, do you have somewhere else to put your money? And I think that given the demand for energy in emerging markets, there has to be opportunities for those big investors to find them. The risk is that they will pick up some investments that will fail along the way. But I think that there is such demand for clean energy that there has to be alternative investments.
Krista, final words?
Good, it's easiest to come last because some of the questions were already addressed. Just a few things to layer in on the potential for green bonds to be an alternative investment to institutional investors. And yes, I think that is part of the question about what can green bonds be the answer to. And I think it's just starting to be liquid enough market that institutional investors are interested. So as I mentioned in my presentation, UniSuper, which is the Australian university pension fund, invested in the World Bank Kangaroo bond. And that was the first time, to my knowledge, that an institutional investor has picked up on green bonds. Alternatively, we saw in Pension Denmark's divestment, they looked into green bonds as an alternative investment, and they decided that it wasn't liquid enough for them to take up now. And so what they're doing instead is investing directly into renewable energy projects. There are other alternatives. Green bonds isn't the only answer, but it's just starting to become of interest to institutional investors, I think. And then to talk about the trickiness of the tricky questions that Axel raised about business as usual, and I agree very much with what you said, that we're not in a CDM world. We don't need to define additionality, But the question about what business as usual is and what alternative choices are has certainly come up in the work that I've done in reviewing green bonds. And we've had issuers, the coal example is an easy one to take. We've had issuers say that we want to include efficiency improvements in coal-fired power plants in our green bond, to which we're very clear that that's not supportive of a low or net zero carbon future. And the argument that we get back sometimes is, well, there's no other good alternative investments. Well, that doesn't fly, at least with me, but it does raise some interesting questions about, are we looking at labeling green bonds as absolutely green or relatively green? And we have a lot of philosophical discussions about this at Cicero and with other colleagues. And I want to keep it as close to absolute as possible, but we're not in a highly regulated market, and it's so far away from the CDM. It is still this Wild West, and I think we're in this early phase where the biggest thing we can do is improve disclosure and transparency. To Henry's point, that's what investors are calling for. They're not calling for a definition on green. Investors don't care. They're equally likely to buy something that is self-labeled green from a commercial bank as to something that has been reviewed as green from a reputable institution. And with that, I think the best that we can do in a market where there aren't these definitions and aren't as many absolutes, the best we can do is to have issuers disclose as much as possible what they're doing, and that's what investors are asking for. So to the extent that third-party reviews are providing that information, that's good. To the extent that reporting metrics are disclosing that, that's also good. It's not incredibly uniform, but I think all these steps towards improving that are incredibly helpful. We are working with BlackRock right now on their impact metrics, so reporting metrics for impact on climate and the environment that they are working with all their investors in. This is the largest investor group in the world, and so we see this opportunity as a big step forward that investors are actually asking for. What is my investment doing? So we see that as a very positive movement, and the more the better. I think we are quite a long ways away from this validation question that was brought up. I think if we have very strict definitions and very strict requirements on validation, that a lot of issuers will be scared away. This is at least what we hear in a lot of conversations, that there's an appeal right now to being able to come out and sign up to the green bond principles, which are this very loose framework. There's nothing required. There's nothing mandated there. There's no strict definitions, but trying to work towards gaining new investors, and I think there is a real value in this positive trend that's not clearly defined yet. And I'm not sure it has to be. I would love to see it more clearly defined. But right now, I think it's okay that the more disclosure we have, the better. So that at least we're not harming the climate in this. So I think that's all.
Thank you. And I'm certainly not going to sort of summarize anything now, because I think that would eat really away from your lunch. So I think thank you very much to all the presenters.